I never thought something as simple as installing security cameras would turn my life into a battlefield, but when the HOA ordered me to remove them, I knew I was in for a fight. At first, I thought it was a mistake. How could they possibly have an issue with me securing my own home? But as I read the violation notice taped to my front door, it became clear that this wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about control. The HOA had been running this neighborhood like a dictatorship for years, and my cameras, the ones that silently recorded everything, had apparently become a threat to their reign. The letter was short, almost smug in its wording: "Your unauthorized security equipment is in violation of community aesthetics. Failure to remove all cameras within 72 hours will result in escalating fines and legal action." I clenched my fists, staring at the cameras I had placed carefully around my house. I wasn't backing down. If they wanted to play this game, I would make sure they regretted it. I had installed the cameras 6 months ago, right after a string of break-ins rattled our usually quiet neighborhood. My neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, a kind elderly woman, had been one of the victims. She'd woken up one morning to find her back door wide open, her living room ransacked. The HOA, despite its constant surveillance of minor infractions, had done absolutely nothing to address the real safety issues in the community. They were more interested in measuring grass lengths and fining people for leaving their trash bins out too long than actually protecting the residents. So, I took matters into my own hands. My cameras weren't intrusive, they were placed only on my property, covering my driveway, front door, and backyard. And yet, somehow, the HOA had decided they were a violation. I knew exactly who was behind this: Martin Grayson, the HOA president. He had made it clear in our last community meeting that he didn't appreciate unauthorized surveillance. He'd gone on a long rant about how private security measures disrupted the uniformity of the neighborhood, how they created an unnecessary atmosphere of paranoia. What he didn't say, but what I suspected, was that my cameras had captured something he didn't want me, or anyone else, to see. I had reviewed the footage regularly, checking for any signs of suspicious activity, and a few nights ago, I had noticed something odd. A sleek black car had pulled up outside my house at exactly 2:37 a.m. Two figures had stepped out, one of them wearing a hoodie, the other appearing to unlock the side gate of a house down the street. But the real kicker? The car's license plate belonged to Martin Grayson's son. I had a choice to make. I could remove the cameras like they demanded, pretend I hadn't seen anything, and go back to living under their ridiculous rules. Or I could escalate. I could make sure that if they wanted me to take down my security measures, they'd regret it in ways they never expected. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee and watched the HOA patrol car drive past my house for the third time in an hour, my decision was clear. If they thought a few letters and threats would intimidate me, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I wouldn't just keep my cameras, I would upgrade my security in ways they could never anticipate. I pulled out my laptop and started making calls. It was time to install motion-triggered alarms, and if the HOA thought they controlled this neighborhood, they were about to learn the hard way that I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. The next morning, the HOA doubled down. A second notice appeared on my door, this time with a fine attached, $500 for non-compliance with aesthetic standards, and an additional warning that every day I refused to remove my cameras would result in another fine. I knew their game. They wanted to financially squeeze me into submission, to make me regret ever questioning their authority. But instead of breaking, I got to work. If they were determined to play this as a war of attrition, I would make sure I had the upper hand. I expanded my security system, installing high-resolution, motion-triggered cameras that covered every inch of my property. I set up automatic cloud backups, ensuring that every frame, every suspicious movement, was stored safely beyond their reach. And then, I did something I knew would send them into a frenzy. I placed a large sign at the entrance of my driveway: "This property is under 24/7 surveillance." It wasn't just for show. By that night, I had already captured multiple HOA patrols circling my house, lingering just long enough to take photos, probably sending them straight to Martin Grayson himself. As expected, the escalation came swiftly. The following evening, just as I was reviewing my latest footage, the power to my security system cut off. A sudden, precise outage that only affected my home. The rest of the street remained perfectly lit, porches glowing, streetlights unwavering. I wasn't surprised. The HOA had access to the community's power grid, and I knew they had the ability to manipulate utilities when it suited their agenda. They had done it before to other residents, turning off sprinkler systems for violators, disabling streetlights near homes of those who had spoken out against them. But what they didn't know was that I had anticipated this move. Minutes after the blackout, my backup battery-powered cameras switched on, and the feed remained uninterrupted. I watched from my phone as a figure approached my front yard, a clipboard in hand, and I immediately recognized the slouched posture and hurried steps, Martin himself. He walked up to the surveillance sign, stood there for a moment, and then turned, scanning the street as if making sure no one was watching. Then, in one swift motion, he ripped the sign out of the ground and stuffed it under his coat. I almost laughed. The HOA president, a man who prided himself on enforcing community rules, had just been caught trespassing on my property, committing an act of vandalism. I let him have his small victory, knowing he had no idea he had just played right into my hands. Instead of reacting, I compiled all the evidence, recordings of HOA members prowling near my property, screenshots of the fines piling up in my inbox, and now, video footage of Martin himself breaking the very rules he claimed to uphold. With everything in place, I did the one thing they never expected: I went public. The next morning, I uploaded a full breakdown of the situation to the neighborhood forum, detailing every move the HOA had made against me. I included timestamps, receipts, a full documentation of my legally installed security system, and, of course, the footage of Martin's late-night trespassing. The post gained traction faster than I expected. Within hours, comments poured in, many from neighbors who had suffered under the HOA's unchecked power for years. Stories of ridiculous fines, invasive rule enforcement, even quiet allegations of favoritism and financial mismanagement. My inbox flooded with messages from residents who had been looking for a way to fight back but had never dared to before. The HOA had operated for so long under the assumption that no one would ever challenge them, that the fear of retaliation would be enough to keep everyone in line. But this time, they had made a mistake. They had come after the wrong homeowner. As the sun set, I watched from my porch as the neighborhood buzzed with conversations, people gathering in small groups, whispering about the footage, about the sudden shift in power. A few streets down, I saw Martin's house, its windows dark, his car absent from the driveway. I could imagine him pacing somewhere, trying to find a way to contain the damage. But there was no containing it now. The people weren't afraid anymore. And this was just the beginning. By the time morning arrived, the damage to the HOA's reputation was spreading faster than they could control. The forum post had ignited something in the neighborhood, a long-suppressed resentment toward the board that was now boiling over into action. Homeowners who had previously kept quiet were now stepping forward with their own grievances, stories of unexplained fees, selective rule enforcement, and the HOA's clear favoritism toward those who bent to their will. The once unshakable authority of the board was crumbling under the weight of its own hypocrisy, and the one person at the center of it all, Martin Grayson, was nowhere to be seen. His car remained missing from the driveway, and his usual morning patrols had stopped entirely. It was clear that he was trying to buy time, scrambling behind closed doors to figure out how to regain control. But control was already slipping from his grasp. The neighborhood wasn't just angry, they were mobilizing. My inbox was overflowing with messages from residents eager to contribute, offering everything from financial records to past violation notices. Someone had even uncovered an old email thread where Martin had casually discussed raising fees on specific homes to encourage compliance. The thread, once buried in a forgotten HOA newsletter, was now being dissected by dozens of homeowners who had long suspected foul play but never had proof, until now. It was no longer just about my security cameras. This had become a full-blown reckoning for the HOA, and the more people dug, the worse it got. Late fees that had been issued without explanation, maintenance funds that had been collected but never used, sudden rule changes that seemed to benefit only a select few. The picture was becoming clear: this wasn't about community improvement. It was about power, control, and financial exploitation under the guise of order. Then, as if sensing the walls closing in, Martin made his next move. That afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was announced, set to take place in the community hall. The email arrived in my inbox like a desperate plea for control, written in a tone that was noticeably defensive rather than authoritative. It urged homeowners to attend, to discuss the recent misinformation circulating online, and to reaffirm the HOA's commitment to community well-being. There was no mention of the security camera incident, no acknowledgement of the mounting accusations, just an attempt to dismiss the uprising as baseless rumors. But the damage had already been done. The homeowners weren't looking for explanations. They were looking for accountability. When I arrived at the meeting that evening, the room was packed. More people had shown up than I had ever seen at any previous HOA gathering, and the usual sense of quiet compliance was gone. Instead, there was a simmering tension in the air, a collective readiness to challenge whatever excuses the board had planned. Martin sat at the head of the table, his usual composure replaced by a rigid stiffness, his fingers tapping anxiously against the desk. The other board members, usually smug in their authority, now looked visibly uncomfortable under the weight of so many watching eyes. They had built their power on silence, on the assumption that homeowners would never question their decisions. But tonight, that silence had been broken, and for the first time, they were outnumbered. Martin began with a rehearsed speech, his voice carefully measured as he insisted that the HOA had always acted in the best interest of the community. He dismissed the forum post as misunderstandings and out-of-context accusations. He claimed that the board had always operated with fairness and that any complaints should have been brought forward through the proper channels, rather than resorting to public defamation. But no one was buying it. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the crowd, homeowners exchanging glances, shaking their heads. Then, one by one, hands started going up, not with questions, but with evidence. Homeowners pulled out printed notices, old emails, receipts of fines that had never been accounted for. Someone held up a screenshot of the surveillance footage showing Martin trespassing on my property, and a murmur of disapproval swept through the room. The more he tried to defend himself, the clearer it became that he had lost control. Then came the final blow. One of the homeowners had done more than just dig through old records. They had contacted a local investigative reporter, who was now sitting quietly in the back of the room, taking notes. As soon as Martin saw him, the color drained from his face. He knew what this meant. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was about to go public. His carefully constructed image, the authority he had clung to for years, was unraveling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The meeting that was supposed to be Martin's chance to regain control had instead become his downfall. The homeowners weren't interested in his empty justifications. They wanted action. They wanted resignations. And by the time the meeting ended, with voices raised and demands for an audit echoing through the hall, it was clear that the HOA as it once was wouldn't survive much longer. Martin had come in hoping to crush the resistance. Instead, he had ignited it even further. And now, as he sat frozen in his chair, watching the neighborhood rise against him, he finally realized the truth. This wasn't his community to control anymore. It never had been. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and unstoppable. By the next morning, the once feared board had lost every last shred of credibility, their carefully maintained facade of authority crumbling under the weight of undeniable proof. Homeowners who had once stayed silent out of fear of retaliation were now emboldened, gathering in groups, exchanging documents, piecing together the extent of the board's corruption. The community that Martin and his allies had controlled for years was no longer afraid, and with every uncovered financial discrepancy, every unjustified fine, and every whispered confession from former board members, their grip on power loosened further. The investigative reporter wasted no time in doing his job. Within 48 hours, an exposé was published, detailing not only the selective enforcement and abuse of power but also the financial mismanagement that had drained the neighborhood's funds. The article laid everything bare: how Martin had funneled money into mysterious beautification projects that never materialized, how certain homeowners had been repeatedly targeted with exorbitant fines while his close friends had been allowed to break every rule without consequence. Even more damning were the interviews from homeowners who had received suspicious threats when they questioned the board's decisions, subtle warnings disguised as friendly advice to fall in line. The article spread like wildfire, and soon, local news stations picked up the story, eager to showcase yet another HOA scandal unfolding in the suburbs. Martin didn't wait around for the full storm to hit. Within a week, he had resigned, his official statement filled with vague excuses about unfounded accusations, and how he had only ever served the best interests of the community. But it was clear that he wasn't stepping down by choice. He was fleeing. His once pristine reputation had been shattered, his power dismantled by the very people he had spent years controlling. Other board members followed suit, some resigning quietly in an attempt to avoid further scrutiny, others attempting to defend their actions only to be drowned out by overwhelming evidence. The HOA, as it had once existed, was finished. But the battle wasn't over yet. With the board dissolved, there was the question of what came next. For years, the HOA had dictated every aspect of life in the neighborhood, ruling with an iron grip disguised as community management. Now, for the first time, homeowners had the chance to reclaim their rights, to establish a system that worked for them rather than against them. A vote was held, not in a secret boardroom but out in the open, with every homeowner given a say. The decision was clear: no more unchecked power, no more arbitrary fines, no more rule by intimidation. The HOA would be restructured, rebuilt with transparency, fairness, and most importantly, accountability. A new leadership was chosen, this time made up of homeowners who had been on the receiving end of the previous board's tyranny, people who understood that a community thrived not under control, but under trust. As for me, I kept my cameras exactly where they were. The ridiculous fines that had been piled against me were dismissed, deemed illegitimate under the new governance. My footage had not only exposed the corruption but had protected the neighborhood, proving what many had long suspected but had never been able to prove. The once powerful board had tried to force me into submission, believing that fear would make me give in, but in the end, they had only exposed their own weakness. My cameras hadn't been the problem. Their corruption had been. And now, with their reign over, the neighborhood was free to move forward without the constant shadow of unjust authority looming over it. Months later, as I stood on my porch, watching the neighborhood slowly return to life, I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. The change was visible. Homeowners who had once kept their heads down now chatted openly, no longer afraid of who might be watching. Yards flourished with personal touches that had once been deemed unauthorized, cars were parked freely in driveways without the fear of fines arriving in the mail the next day. The community had become exactly that, a real community, no longer just a collection of houses governed by unnecessary rules. The fear that had once ruled this neighborhood was gone, replaced by something new. Something stronger. And as for Martin, he had disappeared entirely. The last anyone heard, he had moved out of town, his name now synonymous with disgrace. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, convinced that no one would ever challenge his authority. But in the end, he had been defeated not by any one person, but by the very people he had tried to control. The war was over, and the neighborhood had won. The neighborhood settled into its newfound freedom with a cautious optimism, as if everyone was still adjusting to the absence of an oppressive force that had dictated their lives for so long. Some homeowners were quick to embrace the change. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another in the past joined forces, repairing fences, repainting street signs, and replanting trees that had been left to wither under the HOA's strict landscaping regulations. The change was gradual but undeniable. The neighborhood, once a place of strict conformity and quiet resentment, was now becoming a place where people actually wanted to live. For the first time in years, the homeowners weren't just paying to exist within a set of arbitrary rules. They were actively shaping their own environment, creating a space that felt personal rather than policed. As I walked through the streets one evening, I noticed how different everything felt. Where there had once been an air of silent compliance, there was now genuine conversation. People lingered outside their homes, greeting each other without the stiff formality that had once been necessary under the watchful eyes of the HOA. The fear of receiving a citation for leaving a trash bin out too long or parking a car in the wrong position had disappeared, and in its place was a sense of ownership, not just of individual homes, but of the community itself. The HOA had spent years enforcing the idea that they were the backbone of the neighborhood, the only thing standing between order and chaos. But in reality, they had been nothing more than an obstacle, a manufactured authority that had thrived on fear rather than functionality. Without them, the neighborhood hadn't fallen apart. It had thrived. Still, the scars of the past remained. There were some homeowners who had benefited from Martin's favoritism, people who had turned a blind eye to his abuses because they had been exempt from the same scrutiny as everyone else. They remained bitter, speaking in hushed tones about how the dissolution of the HOA was a mistake, how without strict oversight, property values would surely plummet. But their words carried little weight now. The neighborhood had seen the truth, had experienced the reality of what life was like without arbitrary fines and constant surveillance. The fear tactics no longer worked, and the handful of voices clinging to the old ways grew quieter with each passing day. My security cameras, the supposed catalyst for this entire war, remained exactly where they had always been. Not a single person had complained about them since the HOA's downfall, proving once again that their original objections had never been about aesthetics or community harmony. They had been about control, about maintaining a system where power was concentrated in the hands of a few rather than shared among the many. That system was gone now, and as I reviewed the footage from my cameras one last time, I saw only what I had always wanted to see: nothing. No patrols circling my house, no HOA enforcers sneaking onto my property, no notes taped to my door in the dead of night. Just an ordinary, quiet neighborhood, finally free to exist without fear. Months passed, and the remnants of the old HOA became nothing more than a bitter memory. The community no longer operated under a system of rigid control, and yet, everything functioned better than before. The fear of receiving unexpected fines had disappeared, replaced by a cooperative spirit where homeowners willingly helped one another rather than reporting each other for minor infractions. The streets, once monitored with an iron grip, were now filled with life, children playing freely, neighbors hosting small gatherings, families finally enjoying their own properties without the looming threat of citations. The absence of the HOA had not led to the chaos that Martin had once predicted. Instead, it had allowed the community to flourish in a way that had never been possible under his rule. Despite his resignation and self-imposed exile, Martin's name still surfaced in hushed conversations, usually accompanied by scoffs or laughter. His downfall had been swift, but his attempts to reclaim his reputation had not stopped. From what little information trickled back into the neighborhood, he had moved to another development several towns over, attempting to secure a new leadership position in a different HOA. But his past had followed him. The news articles detailing his corruption had made sure of that, and no community was eager to welcome a man whose name had become synonymous with abuse of power. He had tried, unsuccessfully, to launch a defamation case against the homeowners who had exposed him, but the sheer amount of evidence stacked against him had made his claims laughable. His influence was gone, and with it, the fear that had once held this neighborhood hostage. Without the HOA siphoning funds under the guise of maintenance, homeowners were able to take direct action to improve their surroundings. The money that had once disappeared into vague expense reports was now being pooled into real projects, repaving sidewalks, updating community spaces, and installing proper security features where they were actually needed. The changes were subtle but meaningful, each one reinforcing the idea that the homeowners were fully capable of managing their own community without an unchecked governing body dictating their every move. What had once been an environment of quiet submission had transformed into something stronger, a place where people actually looked out for each other rather than turning to an authority figure to enforce unnecessary restrictions. My security cameras remained exactly where they had always been, untouched and unquestioned. They had never been about violating neighborhood aesthetics or disrupting the so-called harmony that the HOA had claimed to protect. They had been about safety, about ensuring that the homeowners had a way to protect themselves in a community where the governing body had failed them. The irony was not lost on me. What had once been labeled as a violation had ultimately been the very thing that exposed the corruption the HOA had spent years covering up. They had tried to use intimidation and legal threats to force me into compliance, but in the end, it had been their own arrogance that had sealed their fate. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the neighborhood move on from the battle that had nearly torn it apart, I felt a rare sense of satisfaction. The war had not been easy, but it had been necessary. The HOA had thrived for years on the assumption that no one would ever challenge them, that homeowners would always comply out of fear rather than conviction. But they had underestimated the people they had spent so long controlling. They had mistaken silence for submission, compliance for acceptance. And when the time had come, the neighborhood had proven that they were stronger than any fine, any threat, any rule designed to keep them in line. The victory was not just mine. It belonged to everyone who had dared to stand up, who had chosen to fight rather than back down. The neighborhood had reclaimed what was rightfully theirs, and with each passing day, the scars of the past faded further into memory. The community that had once been bound by rules and regulations was now free to exist on its own terms. And as I looked out at the quiet, peaceful street, I knew with certainty that no HOA, no self-proclaimed authority, would ever control this neighborhood again.